Hi, this is Doug Goldstein. I am very excited to share an interview I just did with Jeff Gramm. He is the manager of Bandera Partners, a New York-based hedge fund. He also teaches at Columbia University, and he came out with a book called Dear Chairman. Dear Chairman is about how people involved in the board on the back end of a company can influence what's going on in a company. A lot of times, shareholders, who are often called shareholder activists, are out there for one political reason or another trying to influence a company. Sometimes it's for politics, sometimes it's for their own personal gain. What's that all about, and how does it affect you? If you own a stock or a mutual fund and there are some activists around pushing their agenda one way or the other, is that good for you? Or is it perhaps bad for you? Jeff Gramm is a real expert. I think you're going to love this interview here on the Goldstein on Gelt Show.
You're listening to certified financial planner Doug Goldstein, host of the Goldstein on Gelt Show, www.goldsteinongelt.com.
Okay, I'm very excited to be talking with Jeff Gramm. He manages Bandera Partners, which is a hedge fund based in New York. He also teaches at Columbia Business School, and he wrote a book called Dear Chairman, Boardroom Battles and the Rise of Shareholder Activism. Now, Jeff, I got a lot of questions about shareholder activism, in fact, about activism overall, but what does shareholder activism look like today?
It's a simple idea, right? Shareholder activism is when a public company shareholder engages with the company that they own. This has been happening through history. My book is essentially in a 100-year history of the movement. What we're seeing today is a real explosion of activism, and it's both, I think, a result of a long bull market and also like the big institutional shareholder base of public companies is generally pretty supportive of activists. And so if you have the right ideas about a public company, there are some people who will listen to you and possibly vote in your favor.
So when you talk about these institutional shareholders, it seems to me that most stocks today are the big ones anyway, are heavily owned by the institutions, which are pension plans and mutual funds. So people listening to you and me talk today, I have an opinion about my stock that I own. Do they really have a voice, or is it just kind of like, calling a call center somewhere?
I think it is incredibly hard as a retail investor to have a voice. If you're invested in a small company, then they might take your phone calls, you can give them your ideas, but really, the way that the market works now is that you have these huge fiduciaries that own the majority of public companies across the world. And those fiduciaries, a lot of them are passive in the ownership sense, in the investing sense, but they're not actually passive owners. And they will support dissident owners if the dissident owners have a compelling case. But as a retail investor, it's incredibly hard to get your voice out there and to get it heard. It is possible. A recent example is there was a shareholder in Virginia, a NASA engineer, who did a shareholder resolution at Virginia Dominion Power. And her resolution, it was about sustainability, and it ultimately got, I think, over $11 billion of shareholder votes in support of her. So if you do have the right ideas and you throw them out there, it's not impossible that you'll get support for it, but it is difficult.
Well, what sort of issues are people raising, or are the institutions raising against the companies?
Well, the real issues ultimately tend to revolve around unhappiness with the management. So lots of times, you'll see these activist campaigns, and they'll talk about operating strategy. They'll talk about capital allocation. They might say you should buy back shares, or you should raise your dividend. They might say you should dispose of this asset. That often is a part of their political campaign to get elected to the board. But really what lots of activism is ultimately about is discontent with the leadership of the company. And that's why lots of activism in the medium term leads to, turnover at the CEO level.
Really? Because I always sort of felt, and maybe you can correct me about this, that it always kind of seems that the guys who are sitting on the board are friends with the guys who are the CEOs, and they go through a lot of the motions to pretend that there's real oversight, but you get the feeling they're not really doing as much as you would like them to. And at the end of the day, they'll sit in the meetings and listen to the shareholders, yell and scream or write letters, but then they go about their business because, for a board member to turn against his other board members or the CEO, that means that maybe he's not going to get another such cushy board job in the future. Or am I just being cynical? You can correct me if I'm just a little bit nervous.
I mean, you are being cynical, but I think that you're being correctly cynical. And I think that through most of history, that's exactly how boardrooms worked, is that they were like an old boys network, and they were very much, part a business institution, but part a social institution. So like you go on a board of directors, you're usually invited by the CEO. You might even invite the CEO onto your board. And like you develop a close relationship with the CEO and the rest of your board, and you are probably indebted to him like for giving you the honor of being on the board. So it's hard to fire that CEO, and that's like what a lot of public company boards have a problem with. Like it's ultimately like they're slower than lots of private companies on replacing an underperforming CEO. You know, there's a chapter in my book that is a lot about the boardroom. It's the story of a lady named Carla Schur, who owned 20% of a public company that her father had founded, and her husband was the CEO. And her husband had populated the board with all of her buddies, and she kind of figured out, like, wait a second, like my husband's not actually doing the best job here for shareholders. And, you know, she ultimately ran a proxy fight to get him fired. And I used that chapter.
That must have been a very rough Thanksgiving dinner, yeah.
Yeah, it was a pretty amazing situation. But, you know, this guy had put together a very good board on paper. These were all reputable businessmen. But they were captured, you know, they were basically indebted to him. Like they, you know, were not going to be a board that would give him the proper level of oversight. It took his wife.
We're talking with Jeff Gramm, who manages Bandera Partners, a hedge fund in New York. He also teaches at Columbia. He's been talking to us about shareholder activism, pointing out that as a guy on the street who may just own a few shares of a company may not have a voice, but institutional investors really do have a voice, and they seem to be getting a little bit more involved. Jeff, let me bring this a little more close to home, and by home I mean my home. Occasionally I see these shareholder activists who are very anti-Israel. They support all sorts of things to hurt the state of Israel, and they are trying to use shareholder activism to force companies to boycott us or to divest from Israel. How's that going for them?
Well, there's a lot of what you would call socially oriented activism, but not pursued by shareholders that actually have a huge financial stake. And so that kind of engagement is very hard to get a lot of support for. So in the U.S., like you've seen lots of groups. You know, there was a religious group in Pennsylvania that did lots of attempted proxy engagement. Like you've seen a lot from PETA that try to pressure public companies through the shareholder meetings. Historically, there had been, you know, what were called gadfly investors that would push corporate responsibility initiatives. You know, those ultimately, they don't generate like the kind of response from the big institutional shareholders that you see from, you know, ideas from parties with, you know, big vested financial interests. But it's a very good question, because ultimately, like the votes in the system, like a lot of them are held by companies like Vanguard and like BlackRock that, you know, they do have a long-term interest in the integrity of the markets, but you have to wonder over the long term, are the incentives going to be aligned properly for their proxy voting to prevent them from being subject to political pressure, to political correctness, to things like that?
So I'm hearing from you, and I'm a little disappointed, but not in you, but just the way it goes, that the interests of the board are not necessarily the interests of the shareholders, meaning forget the fact that people might argue over how to succeed, meaning the institutional shareholders might say, yeah, we think you should fire this CEO and hire that one because he'll make earnings better. In other words, they're not arguing over the tactic of that. They may have other interests in mind, which makes this whole thing a little bit more nefarious. I'd like to think that maybe they would argue over that, and everyone at the end of the day is trying to be as profitable for the shareholders as possible, but that's not the case.
Ultimately, the broad incentives are all aligned, right? Like the board wants the best thing for the shareholders and its employees and the stakeholders. But look, like we're all human, right? We all have a lot of self-interest, and you would be naive to argue that if you're on the board of Coca-Cola and they're paying you $500,000 a year and it's like a real cush gig, there could be situations where you put like your loyalty to the CEO even if he's underperforming, ahead of your loyalty to the shareholders that you don't have as close a connection with. I use Coca-Cola as a purely hypothetical example, but humans are very influenced by their direct incentives, and our corporate governance systems are not perfect for that reason.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, it's really fascinating, Jeff. Unfortunately, we are just about out of time, but I know you've written a lot and you teach a lot about this. So tell us in the last few seconds, how can people follow you and follow your work?
Sure. I do have the book, Dear Chairman, which is available on the internet, on Amazon and other places. I have a website, dearchairman.com, where I put up my event dates, and I have been traveling all over the world to promote the book. And I'm on Twitter, Jeff_Gramm, Gramm, which is mostly me doing a bunch of jokes and pictures of my kids and stuff like that.
All right. We will put links to all of that at the show notes of today's show at goldsteinongelt.com. Jeff Gramm, thanks so much for taking the time.
Thanks a lot, Doug. It was fun.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Check out all of Doug's money ideas at goldsteinongelt.com. Doug specializes in helping people who live outside the United States handle their U.S. investment accounts. If you have a question that you would like answered on the air or off, contact Doug at his website or send him an email to doug@profile-financial.com.